It worked. Good afternoon, Society for Range Management and other participants. Welcome to the Strategic Targeted Grazing to Reduce Fine Fuels, updates on the Idaho and Nevada Demonstration Areas Symposium. This symposium is being recorded. I'm Janie Montblanc and will be your moderator today, along with Corey Gooker, and both of us are from the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. We'll begin with an introduction to the symposium, followed by presentations on the Soda Fire and Elko demonstration areas. And we have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. We'll take questions after all the presentations, and we'll only do questions in between presentations if time allows. Please type your questions into the chat box, and if you have a question that's directed to a particular speaker, then type their name at the beginning of the question. And with that, I think we'll let Jessica Phillips take it away. Please introduce yourself and give us a background on this symposium.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Jessica Phillips and I'm a rangeland management specialist from the Bureau of Land Management headquarters, formerly known as the Washington office. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's not in presentation mode, but we can see it.
Okay, let's fix that now.
There we go. Looks
All
great.
right. So a little background on how we got here. Targeted grazing for fine fuels started with the Secretarial Order 3336 in January 2015 that was entitled Rangeland Fire Prevention, Management, and Restoration. This Secretarial Order focused on management and conservation of greater sage-grouse habitat in the Great Basin. And targeted grazing was identified as one possible treatment for conserving these habitats. As a result of that secretarial order, an interagency group was formed, and the Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy was published in May of 2015. Action items 5 and 6 are specific to targeted grazing and other grazing management associated with the greater sage-grouse habitat goals and objectives. Following this meeting, a second meeting of interagency scientists was formed, and the strategy actionable plan was published in October 2016. And the science needs and next steps in the invasive topic had a targeted grazing focus. Number 4 was the assess effectiveness of targeted grazing with livestock. And the bullets are some of the focus areas for short-term science needs. Following this, on June 7th, 2017, Secretarial Order number 3353 was published, which expanded the area of possible targeted grazing treatments to the 11 Western states, and was still focused on targeted grazing to reduce fine fuels within the sage-grouse habitats. This was followed in January 2nd, 2019 by Secretarial Order 3372, reducing wildfire risks on Department of the Interior land through active management. This had more of a wildfire management focus and broadened the scope of the use of existing grazing permits and targeted grazing practices to reduce fine fuels on active grazing allotments and lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. Some tools that came from these secretarial orders include the mule deer and sage grouse categorical exclusion that was included as part of the 2018 Farm Bill. And the bullets provide the focus areas of that categorical exclusion. Possible treatments do include targeted grazing to mitigate hazardous fuels and control noxious and invasive weeds. Another tool that we have worked on through a Great Basin group is the programmatic EIS for fuel breaks in the Great Basin. The map on the right identifies the area of analysis with a blue line, and the more refined analysis area is in green. This PEIS focused on linear features such as roads and right-of-ways for targeted grazing and other fuel reduction treatments. The treatment maximum is 500 feet width with 50 feet maximum for brown strips. The first project has been signed in the Twin Falls district of Idaho, and we recently received a notice of intent to challenge that decision. For more information on this possible tool, please see e-planning, and there's a link here in the video. Another tool that we have completed is the PEIS for fuels reduction and rangeland restoration in the Great Basin. This decision was signed January 14th of 2021, and there are currently no projects on the queue for going through this project. For more information on this possible tool for targeted grazing projects, again, please see the link for e-planning. And finally, the state of Nevada put together an EA on targeted and prescribed grazing for annual grasses in the Great Basin ecoregion of Nevada. This has gone through a final EA and FONSI, but no decision has currently been signed. The purpose is listed here, and for more information on this possible tool, please see the e-planning link in this presentation. And with that, I will yield my time to the next presenter and answer any questions.
We have about 1 minute, I think. Let's see if there are any immediate questions. It doesn't look like it. So Mike, if you want to get queued up.
Okay.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Mike Pellant. I'm a retired BLM rangeland ecologist. Worked 40 plus years and mostly in Idaho. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project, targeted grazing, that I'm working on as a contractor for BLM. Just going to kind of briefly give a little more background on the program. Just talk about a resource center we're setting up on the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange website, and then a little more specific to the targeted grazing demonstration areas. I'll just start with the symposium that we held last year on targeted grazing to reduce fine fuels in the Great Basin. And we took a broader approach. We were looking at dormant season grazing as well as strategic targeted grazing. As you can see from the slide, there was a lot of interest, and I think there continues to be a lot of interest in the use of targeted grazing to manage fine fuels. So really, there's kind of two approaches now. One is a more strategic approach of grazing fuel breaks, which we're talking about today. And then the other is using livestock dormant season grazing or whatever to meet some vegetation management objectives, as well as to reduce residual fuels. So the Resource Center is basically a prototype. The literature section, we have it fairly well populated with studies that relate to targeted grazing of fine fuels. I will point out that we're addressing both the targeted grazing for the fuel breaks as well as dormant season grazing. And we're really hopeful that this will kind of be the go-to place in terms of sharing information on these two approaches and then the intermediate approaches that are developing as well. I mentioned the literature. Actually, the implementation guidance, all of the links that Jessica provided, we'll have those loaded up in here so you can go and get information on from the environmental assessment or EIS standpoint of implementing the program. So I'm okay, I'm sorry if I was muted. I'll just move ahead in the interest of time. The Murphy Complex fire of 2007, 653,000 acres, one of the largest, second largest fire in Idaho history. The point here was there was a lot of controversy, too much grazing, not enough grazing. The state director of BLM at the time put together an interagency team to address this. And one of the promising things, and this is no new news to many of you, where we have herbaceous plant communities, in this case crested wheatgrass and grazing, we can reduce the effects of the fire behavior and fire extent, as opposed to these big unburned big sagebrush stands shown in the lower right of this photo. So based upon that, we moved ahead with a team. Just point out that Karen Launchbaugh was the lead of the team, and then Pat Clark, who's going to speak later, was also a member of this team. Kind of synthesizing out of this came a recommendation to develop a pilot project for a landscape scale area, strategic placing grazed blocks or pastures to create fuel reduction bands. So again, I think there's a lot of emphasis that's been growing, as demonstrated by out of the 2007 Murphy Complex fire, and then a lot of the recent initiatives through the Department of Interior. So the bottom line is, with these targeted demonstration areas, we have the one in Southwest Idaho out of Boise District with the Soda Fire. And then the Elko District also has a large targeted grazing demonstration area. And then this spring, we're, I think, pretty sure that we're going to have the Lakeview District in Oregon. They had some litigation. I think that's all cleared up, and they'll be starting another one. But anyway, this is the approach that we're looking at in terms of these demonstration areas. Basically, as the cow says, you mean you want me to create a fuel break? And the answer is yes. So we really designed this program to be kind of a three-pronged effort. First, the managers identify, where they want the strategic grazing to occur, the fuel break itself, and we want it in place by the beginning of the fire season. From the permittee standpoint, we're looking at them to use their knowledge and skills and abilities to design a strategy to meet that goal. And then finally, we're looking at ARS, to Agricultural Research Service, to conduct some rigorous scientific studies that Pat will talk about. We want to know not only the effectiveness, but the effects of the targeted grazing on the fuels themselves, on the vegetation and the soils. What we're hoping is, with this information, we can really address this question of too much, not enough grazing, and say, under these kind of conditions, to create a fuel break, here's the benefits and here's some of the impacts, and then kind of move forward from that. So just kind of close with some of the strategies that you'll hear a lot more about. The Elko district actually has one of the projects is a 26-mile long fenced fuel break that actually the grazing occurs within this and is concentrated in this area. The soda fire, we have one of the permittees is using herding on a six day a week effort to just keep livestock where they belong. And then obviously water supplement distribution is another approach. These arrows point to some small stock water tanks that are moved frequently along the road to meet the objectives that have been set for the fuels management and the targeted grazing. So we are asking for some help. The literature section of our website or our Targeted Grazing Resource Center, not just research, but if there's any other studies or reports, we would like to see those and we'll get those posted. If you know of any other projects or studies evaluating livestock management strategies to manipulate these invasive annual grass communities, very interested in those as well. We want to make linkages so that we can kind of share information across the Great Basin on these different projects. And then finally, we'd like to put together some more hands-on targeted grazing workshops for land managers, livestock operators. If you're interested in this approach and helping with this, we would be very interested in hearing from you on that. And I will just close with kind of the message to me from the Murphy Complex fire was the scale of our treatments, including targeted grazing, need to be commensurate with the size and scale of not only the current, but the future wildfires. And I think we have that opportunity with livestock grazing, which is fairly ubiquitous across the landscape. How can we better use it to meet fuels management objectives in a strategic and I think in an effective way? So I will end with that. And again, I'm probably out of time, so we can maybe ask some questions or have some input at the end.
Actually, Mike, you have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Let's see, I think this is just a comment, but UNR is investigating the concept of fecal seeding with desirable species. We are in the lab level work now and will move to feedlot and field studies in the fall of 21 and 22.
Oh.
And then another question, what is the website you just mentioned?
The Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. I think you can Google that and find it. And to get to the targeted grazing, just type the targeted grazing in the search mechanism, and it'll take you to our prototype we're setting up.
And we can put that link right in the chat too. So we'll do that in a second.
Okay, perfect.
There's actually a link on the agenda that I sent in the chat. You can find the links there.
Great. For new people that that arrived before we started, they won't see that link to the agenda. So we can just add that link again. We'll do that. Okay. Let's see. That looks like all the questions. So we can move on to you, Lance. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
And Mike, while Lance is sharing his screen, it was me that muted you for it was just a second. I accidentally did that while I was trying to move my windows around. I apologize.
No problem.
Did it come up yet?
Not yet.
Maybe I got to double click.
Oh, it looks like it's, yeah, there, now we see it. So now we just need it in presentation mode and then you'll be ready. Yeah, looks great.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Lance Okeson. I work here in the Boise district in the fuels program. I've been here, it'll be 14 years this spring. I've been in fire since 1984. I do have a Bachelor of Science degree from Oregon State in rangeland resources. So I've always been in and around the Great Basin my entire life, and fire, of course, is a big issue for us, and here on the Boise district, as it is with most folks that are tuned in. So I got 15 minutes, I think, and I'll just start down through this. A lot of stuff to cover. Our field break strategy here on the Boise district for this targeted grazing effort came out of the soda fire from 2015. And in 2015, we had a big fire. It was 280,000 acres, I think it ended up, when they finally got things all sorted out with all the islands and all that stuff. But one of the things we wanted to do was try this targeted grazing on some of the fuel breaks. We did an environmental assessment to authorize about 271 miles of fuel breaks in and around the soda footprint. We did that for multiple reasons. One, the biggest one, of course, is that, you know, anytime after a wildfire, you have a real explosion of fine, flashy fuels, and you actually have an increased risk to reburn. And of course, we didn't want to do that. We had a lot of ESR investments. And then, of course, we have, it's right next to Boise. So you got a lot of firefighter and public safety issues and all that stuff. So that was kind of our idea behind the fuel break strategy. It was signed in 2017 in March. And I think we'll be going into our 5th year of actual implementation, probably the 4th year of full implementation, where we've actually got the Idaho portion. The EA actually covered a portion into Oregon. The fire burned along the border there in Idaho and Oregon. So when we did the EA, we included parts of the Vail district. Right now, as of the date, only the Idaho side's actually implemented any of the targeted grazing. The Vail district hasn't yet. Hopefully sometime in the future, we can get that sorted out. Couple things that we really spent a lot of time on and make this thing unique or it's different from how other grazing authorizations have come. We authorize our treatments on an annual basis, and we'll get into the exact what the treatment is here in a second. But and we do it through a letter that's pointing back to the EASV authorization. There was a lot of debate for months. And I think we had every person that thought they knew everything that they could know about grazing regs and all of that at the table. And in the end, we took a path to get away from the grazing regs because, again, the authority to do the treatment is through the decision record in the EA. And there was a lot of people at the table, most of them range people, that wanted us to be tied to the grazing regs. And we didn't do that. And boy, in hindsight, that was fantastic. And it's really working good. So in regards to the treatment window for our targeted grazing, like Mike mentioned earlier, we want our treatment effectiveness on the ground pre-fire season. So we have spring grazing. It goes from March 1 to June 30th on an annual basis. Our method is primarily using herding and supplements like Mike was talking about. We can use electric fence limited to avoidance areas, keeping them out of the riparian areas. If there's a certain stretch where we really want to focus them, we can use electric fence for that. And at first that was really controversial. Of course, everybody was kind of upset that we were trying to use a technique that was going to primarily rely on herding, water, and supplements. And I can tell you last year, we had one of the operators actually try an electric fence in one piece of the one of his pastures that he does his implementation on. And I think he went 2 days and gave up on it and went back to the herding. And water is actually working really well once these operators commit to it. They actually like it. And I have been stunned at how much time they've put into it. It's been fantastic. Let's go to kind of how we designed this, the actual footprint of the fuel break. And of course, this will lend itself to the herding in the water. So you got the road in the middle of the screen here. That's your break in your fuel continuity. That's the true fuel break on the landscape. And then what we want them to do is on 200 feet each side of that road, is our basically our target area or treatment area. And we want to, our objective there is 2-inch stubble height or less on that 200 feet. So you got a 400 foot footprint there with the road. Now where we came up with 2 inches, that is just a starting point. That's a guess. This area where we have this fuel break located is all primarily converted over to a lot of annual grasses, primarily cheatgrass. There's some pockets of sandbergs in there and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's kind of an annual grassland, low elevation. It's kind of at the bottom of the ecological threshold. And knowing that it's primarily a herbaceous fuel model, right? It's continuous fuels. And the thing is cheatgrass carries fire, whether it's 4 inches tall and dense, or whether it's 12 inches tall and dense. So what we really wanted to get down to was at what level of grazing do you get actually to start breaking the fuel continuity in cheatgrass, because that's really what we're doing here on this fuel model, right? Is we're trying to graze to the point that we break fuel continuity. And that fuel continuity, I describe it to people as we want to see a fire struggle to move through the fuel break, not just freely flow across it. So that was really what we're getting at. Now, after doing this for 4 years, going into our 5th year, I think that probably 4 inches is probably where we need to be. Okay. 2 inches, I think, is a little too much. And it's hard for cows with their mouths, the way they're designed, to get to that. And it's also opens up more bare ground, I think, and it probably leads to more weeds probably over time. So I think 4-inch stubble heights is probably where we need to be. That's Lance's personal opinion after doing this for a few years. So since we did this, we wanted to focus in on the fuel break being established with not using extensive fencing. The next thing is what we call the graduated use area. So you got your 200 foot each side of the road. That's kind of our fuel break. And then you got a 1/4 mile outside of that, we can allow up to 30% utilization on native bunch grasses. And then the next 1/4 mile, you can go to 16% utilization. And that's that graduated use. So we know that the animals aren't going to stop at the 200 foot. They're going to mingle, and they're going to drift and all that stuff, but they're going to spend the idea is that they're going to spend the primary amount of their time in that 200 foot, and for sure within the first 1/4 mile. So that's how we set up our basically how we designed it. And at first, like I said, a lot of people were kind of like, man, we're going to have lots of fencing. We're going to have to, we've got to have the electric fence. And I thought that too. I really did. But I'll tell you what, when you get the right operators and they get after it with the riding and the water and moving the tanks regularly, this design right here has been actually working really well. So we'll go on for that. This is just another diagram of the fuel break concept. Again, you got your fuels treatment zone. That's our grazing zone, and then the roadway. Here's what it looks like in one of our pastures. Again, what we've done here we've actually mowed out 200 feet each side. So that's your 400 foot footprint. Again, the sagebrush is what's driving your big fire behavior. It's not so much the herbaceous grasses in August. It's the sagebrush that's given all the problem fire behavior, flame lengths, rate of spread, and difficulty to catching is the sagebrush. So we always get the brush out of our fuel breaks, and then the grazing can focus on the herbaceous matter that's left. The road here in the center, we call that the haul road, of course, because that's what we use for hauling the supplements and the water. It was, like I say, this is over 30 miles. Parts of this road, we had to actually put some decent road work into. It was pretty expensive. Other parts we didn't have to do anything with. Looking back on what we did, we put a lot of time and effort into the road because we didn't want that to be one of the things that if this worked or it didn't work, if it didn't work, we didn't want it to be because the BLM didn't give them a good road to be able to haul water on. So, you know, we put more effort and money into that road than I would if I was taking this out to another piece of ground that just had marginal roads. I think what I would do is I would just work with the roads you have, because the road work actually ends up being the most controversial thing about fuel breaks. If you've been dealing with fuel breaks much, the road work is what gets everybody spun up. So I would minimize the road work. But for our project here, we really wanted to take that as not something that was going to set anybody up to fail. So we put more into that than I normally would if I was to do this again on some other landscape. Just another look into it, you know, from a different angle, a different pasture, stuff like that. Here's a map of the so the over here on the left is the Idaho border. Can you see my cursor moving around? Probably not.
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can. Okay, so here's the Oregon-Idaho border, and it actually goes clear over here to a place called Sucker Creek. But this is the actual map of the fuel break going across here. Here's Highway 95 coming south out of Marsing, going to Jordan Valley, and it goes all across this Oahe front, we call it. Anyways, you can see there's lots of different pastures. There was lots of different allotments. I can't remember how many allotments we crossed, but it is a huge amount because they've got kind of a lot of small pastures and a lot of small allotments. One of the things that was kind of some of the ground rules, I guess you would call, or sideboards for trying to design this treatment was that we couldn't go into any of the existing permits and adjust those. So we had to design a treatment in and around the existing grazing systems. And part of, not all, but a big part of the reason for that was a lot of those allotments were actually, at the time we were doing this, were in litigation. So nobody was willing to, of course, get tangled up in that. So, you know, again, hindsight, if you could do it right, obviously, if you can adjust your permit and make the grazing permit line up with your treatments is the way to success. So
We've got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for that. Some of the lessons learned, we take a you know, time every year to do a report and a field trip and talk with the operators and all that stuff. And these are some of the ones that I came up with when putting these together. You know, it takes a few years for the operators to get their minds around it and to adjust their operations. They have to make a lot of adjustments, and it takes a lot of work. Number two, labor intensive. It's a lot more labor than I think we all thought of in the beginning, and it's definitely, that holds true. I just mentioned 3 about that. A lot of communication. We're talking with these guys multiple times a week, all through the thing, pre and post. It already hit the 4-inch stubble height. I think is better than the 2-inch. And then again, annual cheatgrass timing. It can vary from a month and a half to a month on a yearly basis for us. So yeah, that tells you got to have tons of flexibility in any treatment that you do. And that's what I had.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lance. There, you have so many wonderful questions queued up in the chat, but since we only have a minute, I figure rather than trying to start answering those, I figured
right on.
Yeah, let's jump to the video and then we'll address.
Oh yeah, right on. Yeah. Okay. So now I stopped sharing, right?
Yeah, you did. You haven't yet. There you go.
All right, we're out, and I'm gonna mute.
All right, thank you so much. And now I will share my screen of the soda fire targeted grazing video. And this worked earlier when we practiced it, so hopefully it does now again.
Big wildfires are burning up crucial wildlife habitat in Idaho and the Great Basin. In 2015, the Soda Fire burned 280,000 acres in Idaho and Oregon in only 8 days. 3 years later, the Martin Fire burned more than 400,000 acres in 4 days in Oregon and Nevada. The list goes on.
Back when I got here, around 1981, a big fire was a fire that was over 100,000 acres. If we fast forward to 2007, we had the Murphy Complex fire over from Twin Falls to the Nevada border. That was 650,000 acres. A couple of years later, 2 fires in Oregon, very close to each other, total fire footprint 1 million acres. So what we're seeing is what we call the mega fires, these huge landscape scale fires.
The big wildfires are burning up some of the best wildlife habitat that's left in the Great Basin. Primo sage steppe habitat for sage grouse and many other wildlife species such as songbirds, pronghorn, and mule deer. Native rangelands also are highly valued by ranchers for livestock grazing. Native perennial plants provide a sustainable food source for livestock and wildlife. To give firefighters a better chance to stop wildfires when they're small, the Bureau of Land Management is working to create a series of strategically located fire breaks. Grass, weeds, and shrubs are the fuel for wildfires on rangeland. The objective is to use livestock to reduce highly flammable cheatgrass vegetation in the spring when it's green and palatable to eat. The goal is to create a fire break 200 feet wide on either side of the road that runs for 30 miles along the front side of the Owyhee Mountains.
The goal is to reduce vegetation there, to provide a safe place for firefighters to operate and hopefully stop any fires. We're using cows to try and attempt to get to that endpoint.
Fuels management is a large part of the solution, but the only ubiquitous fuel manager that's on this land are all the livestock that graze it. So the challenge, can we marshal those livestock into strategically doing fuel work that's going to have a huge impact given the scale of the wildfires that are occurring out here now. So I think there's a lot of promise.
In the Owyhee front, the objective is to graze cheatgrass and grasslands down to a 2 to 3 inch standard by June 30th. By the end of the spring season in 2020, the cattle were hitting that standard to create fire breaks and safe zones for firefighters. A continuous carpet of short cheatgrass mowed by cattle could be seen at the base of the Owyhee front.
And it's going really well this year. This will be the 3rd year of full implementation. I think we've reached a lot of our objectives in big portions of that fuel break.
Participating ranchers support the program.
Yeah, I think it's a good program to keep going. We're still in the experiment stage. It's kind of new to everybody, so but I think it's going in a good direction. Well, we just had the soda fire not too long ago, and that kind of fire is not very good for anybody. So anything you can do to help slow those catastrophic fires down and help the firefighters out, that's good in my book.
We've learned a lot. We've tried different classes of cattle to see what would work the best, and trying to hold cattle in certain areas has been kind of tough. You have to ride every day and keep water available right at where you want.
Under the BLM targeted grazing program, the ranchers bear the cost of herding, water hauling, and managing livestock to create the fire breaks. And the BLM provides the public range at no cost as an incentive for ranchers to participate. The alternatives are mechanical mowing, blading, seeding, or spraying herbicides to control vegetation, all of which cost taxpayers more money. Ranchers say the benefits outweigh the costs so far.
Well, it's cheaper to feed hay.
Daniel Richards says his cattle have shown good weight gains, even on dry cheatgrass.
Yeah, they've been doing pretty good. Even the year that we did it in May on dry feed, the cattle did very well on it.
Pellant is working together with Pat Clark, research team leader for the Agricultural Research Service, on a research study to see how experimental targeted grazing projects are working in Idaho, Elko, Nevada, and Lakeview, Oregon. The research is tracking how much fuel is reduced by targeted grazing, changes in plant composition in targeted grazing areas, and what methods seem to work best to keep cattle focused on firebreak areas next to existing roads. In the second year of the study in Elko, the grazed firebreak helped to snuff a grass fire. The Boulder Creek fire started on a Monday, and it was 100% contained at 1,030 acres in 48 hours. The research site west of Elko is tracking the effectiveness of targeted grazing in a 21-mile-long pasture. The pasture is fenced on both sides of the firebreak. It's been grazed by up to 2,400 cow-calf pairs from March to May. Stocking rates have varied. Using permanent fence to focus cattle on firebreak areas is highly effective, but expensive. Rancher Daniel Richards tried using temporary solar fencing to keep cattle focused on the firebreak area in the Owyhee front.
First year we did it with fencing, and that was later in May, and the whole thing was dry. And we still got good results, but yeah, put fencing to keep it.
Since then, Richards has used herding, water, minerals, salt and protein supplements to keep his cattle focused on the firebreak area.
We're trying to keep the cows right here as much as possible without having to put in miles and miles of fence. And cows they do what cows do. So when it's cool weather, they always fan out a lot more, spread out. They have their favorite spots in this allotment that they've had for years. So it's kind of trying to train my cows to stay here during a certain time. It can be tricky, fairly labor intensive.
Overall, the grazing management side of the project is challenging because ranchers raise their cattle to spread out and disperse on the range.
Before we have done this targeted grazing, that's what we tried to do, is get our cows spread out as much throughout the allotment, so they're not really hammering on one spot versus another spot. But now we're trying to train them the other way.
Well, yeah, to hold them in an area, yeah, that's the tough part, is keeping them focused on eating and just this grass along the road.
Blackstock uses a range rider to keep his cows focused on the firebreak areas.
I've been really lucky to have Howard. He's been really good about taking on this project. He's riding his horses. So it really works good for us.
The ranchers do like being able to graze livestock on the cheap grass when it's ripe and palatable, starting about March 1st.
This year, things have been working a lot better. We got to come out here quite a bit earlier and got the cows on the cheap grass while it was nice and green. So they were happy. We kept them happy with the water, and kept them where we wanted them with the water and the salt. And that's been key.
Okeson says it's interesting how the ranchers are using different management techniques.
We have one operator that's completely using herding and has actively got cowboys out there every day and is moving the animals where they need to be. Others are taking a more passive approach and just using the supplement and water, and then once a day maybe focusing the animals down to where they should be, and that's working for them. And then we've got another one that's working on doing some extensive, temporary electric fencing.
At a bigger scale, the BLM is rolling out ambitious plans to create about 990 miles of fire breaks along existing roads on 3.6 million acres of public lands under the Tri-State Fuel Breaks Project in Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon. The BLM plans to use a mix of mowing, seeding, and blading to create hundreds of miles of fire breaks per year. Targeted grazing will be used as one method of maintaining those fire breaks.
Again, you're trying to modify fuels, and that modifies your fire behavior, right? So as a fire burns into one of these fuel breaks, like let's take the targeted grazing one,
your flame lengths are going to be reduced, and the rate of spread is going to go way down. And of course, that's going to make your fire community more successful in that fuel break.
Okeson reminds us about the fire triangle: oxygen, heat, and fuel.
If you break any one of those legs, in other words, if you take oxygen away, it can't burn, right? So land management agency control over is the fuel.
Lessons learned from the targeted grazing project in the Owyhee Front, plus findings from the research project on targeted grazing, will provide guidance on how best to create fire breaks in the future, Okeson says.
Can we do this at a landscape level? Can we graze on an annual basis in a strategic manner and reach our objectives? So far, we're showing good results. I'm really excited. I really like the project.
Everybody's been bouncing ideas of what's working and what's not working, and I think we're kind of coming along with it. Yeah, for a fuel break, so makes a lot of sense to me.
All right, thanks everyone. Now, let's see here. We have about 4 minutes for questions before Pat's presentation, so we can start addressing some of those previous questions if we want to stay on track with our time. All right. The very first question, actually, I think might have been for Mike, but any one of you could probably answer it. What is the target stocking rate for a fuel break? What kind of feedback are you getting from the producers?
Well, this is Mike, and I mean, the obvious answer is it depends. So I think every situation is going to be governed in a large part on how much cheatgrass is there, how many livestock are going to be needed for what length of time to reach your target of 2-inch stubble height or 4 inches, as Lance was talking about. So it's a hard question to answer given how much variability there is year to year in cheatgrass fuel production.
Great, thanks, Mike. All right, this was the first one for Lance. Have any of your livestock users expressed interest in virtual fencing?
Virtual fencing defined by, you mean the electric cow collars? As I think is what he means by that. And yeah, we are, in fact, we put in for funding to try that this year, and we didn't get funding for it. So we're shooting for next year, hopefully, to get the money. And we've got one of the operators is willing and ready to do all the extra work that it's going to take and learn how to use the program and all that stuff. And I think that virtual fencing is the future. I think in 20 years it's going to be pretty common. So yeah, we are going down that path. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And I think you might have answered this in your presentation, but the next question is, what have the problems been with electric fencing? Is it cumbersome to put up in the terrain, poor charge, or something else?
For the cows just aren't trained to it. There's a lot of training, and the operator that tried it, those cows weren't used to electric fence and didn't respect it. They just blew through it every day, and drug it all up the hill. So yeah, I think if you got them trained up to it, that'd be a whole different deal. But yeah, I really think that's probably what was going on there.
Great, thanks. And I think this might have been answered in the video, but are livestock producers being paid to accomplish the BLM's fuel break objectives?
So on our stuff, no. Like I say, we authorize it through a letter of authorization. and back to what the first question was in regards to stalking rate, it is really variable, like Mike was saying. And again, what we're looking for is an outcome. We want the stubble height and that thing, and how many cows they use within that window is totally up to them. And so, again, it's truly outcome based. Here's what we want for an outcome. You get us there. And so we aren't paying for any of that. The state of Idaho is reimbursing the operators if they meet their targets or their objectives for some of the water haul, the cost of fuel. So the governor's office has been helping us out on that side. So there is some cost. There's a lot of work, and so they have been getting some funding through the Idaho governor's office. Yeah, for that part.
Great, thank you so much. And there's many more great questions for the discussion, but now we'll move on to Pat Clark's presentation, talking about the experiment on the soda fire. Pat, would you like to introduce yourself?
I sure would, thank you. I'm Pat Clark. I'm a range scientist with USDA Ag Research Service based in Boise. How's my volume? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sound great.
Great. So we've talked a lot about the soda fire and different things so far, but I would like to take a step back and talk about framing the multiple different projects that are involved in this large multi-regional experiment that we have going on that spun out of the Secretarial Order 3336 that was originally talked about in our first talk here. What we've done here from a research standpoint is, instead of having a bunch of individual case study demonstration projects on their own, which can yield some limited science, we've got in front of that train a little bit as things started up, and put each one of these projects, demonstration projects, or what I would prefer to call them, as complete spatial replicates within this experimental design. And so each one of those, the soda fire, Elko, and other, are complete studies on their own 2 feet, but also part of the experimental or the multi-regional experiment that I'm going to talk about. And Mike asked me to talk about some of the results, research results we've got out of it so far. So I'm going to start by talking about the soda fire, and then I have a second presentation on later this afternoon on the Elko site. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. And if there's a delay, the delay is just me waiting for the slide to pop up. So
No, it's me. This worked earlier and now it's not.
no problem.
There we go. Do you see it yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go. Okay, so I mentioned multi-regional experiment. At this point, the motivation, the main objective for this is to evaluate the efficacy of targeted grazing for creating and maintaining fuel breaks. And as I said, we want to test this kind of thing across the broad scope, essentially the area that's being impacted in the Western US by cheatgrass and the potential to influence the frequency and size of wildfires. So I'm going to talk about one project site within 3 ongoing projects that we have within this experiment. Next slide, please. And that's the soda fire. But we're actually looking to make this truly multi-regional by looking for sites outside the Great Basin that are also influenced by cheatgrass and wildfire. So looking for sites in Wyoming and southeast Washington, and we have a potential target site with interest from the National Park Service and Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. Next slide, please. So starting out with the soda fire, Lance showed a map of kind of the layout of the soda fire project. It's on the order of 26 miles long, or extending from the Oregon border southeast across the Hawaii front. And there are multiple allotments and multiple pastures involved. From a research standpoint, we needed to be fairly picky and choosy in terms of which of those allotments and pastures would fit a research design. We identified 3 different allotments with a pasture in each to be the replicates within this project, and those are the Elephant Butte allotment, Reynolds Creek, and Hard Trigger. Next slide, please. And this ARS part of the project has been funded by the Washington office for BLM to both put this, all these demonstration projects within this multi-regional experiment, put everything in a research context, as well as conduct some fairly intensive monitoring at each, so that we are collecting data that stands up to research grade scrutiny. So we're using AIM, but it's an enhanced version of AIM in terms of the protocols we apply, as well as some additional variables that we sample. We can break our responses that we're sampling into 2 classes. Really, it's treatment attainment. How well are we doing putting the treatment on the ground, and are we getting the kind of outcome that Lance is shooting for at the soda fire or the managers at other sites? So fuel height, Lance mentioned a 2-inch stubble height. We're also looking at fuel continuity as measured by canopy gap size. And then we're also looking at that fuel load, and height and load certainly can go into fire behavior models. But we certainly need to be thinking about how to best handle fuel continuity, because it is a game changer, I believe. And then on the other side, what kinds of effects targeted grazing might be having on the ecosystem itself? Changes in production, changes in cover. Are we increasing the amount of bare ground? Are we opening the door for noxious weeds, reducing species richness, and impacting the soils? So that's what we're looking at as part of this research data collection effort. Next slide, please. So key findings, we're into the results now. What we're finding is that targeted grazing can and has been reducing the residual fuel heights, both the total herbaceous fuel height as well as the cheatgrass fuel height. We have yet to meet that 2-inch stubble height target, but as Lance said, that may be less important than the outcome of simply changing the fuel continuity or some other measure of continuity that would change fire behavior. We've also been able to reduce fuel loads for total herbaceous as well as cheatgrass. However, the way we've been measuring fuel continuity with canopy gap, we're not seeing necessarily a change there in fuel continuity. And it either may be real that we're not quite getting down to enough removal or changing of those fuels, or it may simply be that we're using the wrong tool to measure continuity. And that's a question for later, perhaps. Next slide, please. So just some bar graphs to look at fuel heights. I'm just going to flash through these. Everybody wants to see a little data. Generally, what we're seeing is reduction in herbaceous fuel, total herbaceous fuel heights. Primarily in 2019, it was coming from the Elephant Butte site. The other two study areas, we're not seeing as pronounced a difference, although they're all significant in the amount of change. In 2020, Elephant Butte and Reynolds Creek both we're seeing reductions. Hard trigger, next slide, please. Hard trigger, however, did not show a reduction. It actually went the other way there. So there's probably enough noise in this data to indicate that there just wasn't enough grazing going on in hard trigger to produce that outcome for 2020. Next slide, please. Similar trends with cheatgrass fuel heights across the way there. Elephant Butte and Reynolds Creek being the primary ones influencing that finding, both having reductions in cheatgrass in 2019 as well as in 2020. Next slide, please. We also saw reductions in fuel loads, a fairly consistent trend all the way across in 2019 and in 20, although in 19, none of the sites actually had a significant treatment effect at the site level, but because the trend was all the way across the board, overall, we found a treatment effect there in 19. In 20, we saw Elephant Butte and Reynolds Creek kind of leading the way in terms of reductions in fuel loads for targeted grazing. Next slide, please. And that was targeted total fuel loads. Here we have cheatgrass fuel loads, somewhat similar, although the main treatment effect seems to have stemmed from the Elephant Butte site, the larger differences there in both 2019 and 2020. Although in 20, we seem to have done a much better job of getting the treatment on the ground. And so there was a fairly consistent trend across all three, although it was not significant at any one site, but overall there was a treatment effect. Next slide, please. On the ecosystem response side, so this is after the treatment's been applied and just how's it affecting the ecosystem itself. We saw changes in cheatgrass cover, tumble mustard cover, Russian thistle cover, and litter cover. Cheatgrass cover was greater than the control. Tumble mustard cover was greater than the control. We saw Russian thistle being greater in the target grazed area. And as you might expect, litter cover was greater in the control, whereas bare ground was greater in the targeted grazing area. In terms of some of the other parameters we measured, those all tended to be similar between treatment and control, with production, foliar cover, basal gap, species richness, and abundance. So overall, we're not seeing any concerning differences in terms of ecosystem response. The differences that we are seeing are largely expected from just changes in cover in some of the targeted fuel species that we're going after. And in terms of ecological integrity, we're not seeing any concerning responses there. Next slide, please.
You got about a minute and a half, Pat.
Good timing. Last slide. So my summary. So this soda fire is just one of 3 complete spatial replicates that we currently have in the multi-regional experiment. We used enhanced AIM methods and protocols to monitor the effects of targeted grazing at these sites. We saw substantial changes in fuel height and fuel load. We saw additional effects on the ecosystem response side, and particularly in cover. And mainly in 2019, 2020, we saw no real differences between treatment and control. And the next steps, I think, for this project and the kind of the future of research in this vein is to look at how our targeted grazing is changing fire behavior, and the easiest way to do that, of course, is looking at fuel models and fire behavior modeling, and how fuel continuity fits into those equations. So that's all I have for the time being. I do have another talk later today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pat. All right. Next, we will move on to Nevada. And Melanie Peterson and Chris Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourselves?
You bet. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melanie Peterson. I'm with the Bureau of Land Management located in Elko, Nevada. I also have a couple other gentlemen on my staff that I would like to have them introduce themselves also. I'll start out with Tom.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Bates. I'm a range specialist with the BLM here in Elko.
Yeah, and I'm Marcus Rose. I'm also a range specialist here in Elko.
Okay, thank you. And Chris Jasmine.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Jasmine. I am the manager of biodiversity and rangelands for Nevada Goldmines, and we are the company that owns the TS Ranch, where the targeted grazing strips we're about to talk about fall. So look forward to talking here a little bit later on.
Great, thank you. And Jeannie, if you could go to our first slide. So this is the targeted grazing project that's been mentioned a few times this morning. This is located outside of Elko, Nevada. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give you a reference on Elko, Elko District lies in the northeast corner of Nevada and encompasses around 12.5 million acres in the Great Basin. Our topography consists of broad valleys separated by mountain ranges with a wide range of elevation. Our vegetation types vary across elevation, from salt desert shrub communities to sagebrush to pinyon juniper woodlands. Next slide, please. So you've heard a lot about how these targeted grazing projects came about. The Secretarial Order 3336 was in January of 2015. The site selections were in 2016. So in 2017, we released the public scoping letter with the draft environmental assessment following in December. And in June of 2017, we signed and sent out the EA FONSI and proposed decision to the interested public, and signing that final decision in 2017. The proposal outlined was to implement research that studies the effectiveness of using targeted grazing by livestock to create and maintain strategically based fuel breaks to assist in protecting of sage-grouse habitat. I'm going to turn that over to Tom.
So this proposal, the proposed targeted grazing was located in 4 different grazing allotments, all of which are in the west central part of Elko County in northeastern Nevada. We had the T-Lazy-S, Hadley allotment, Blue Basin, and Carlin Field. So you can see on the map that is shown there, the targeted areas are highlighted in green. In Carlin Field, it's difficult to see because the area was only about 60 acres. Next slide, please. This is just a table which shows the total acreage for each of the treatment and target areas. So within the T-Lazy-S, there was about 8,000 total acres. In Hadley, 442, Carlin, 59, and 148 in Blue Basin, for a total of 8,828 acres within the treatment area. That was a mixture of obviously both public and private lands, as is shown there. Next slide, please. So in order to complete this project, we constructed or had constructed a lot of fencing, about 40 miles total around these project areas in the T-Lazy-S, the Carlin, and the Blue Basin. The Hadley strip was actually not grazed due to ownership issues that arose. I'm going to turn it over to Marcus.
Okay, so we authorized water hauling in all these areas because in some of these areas there wasn't any available water, and then in the other areas like T-Lazy-S, it's just so big and there wasn't enough water to be able to support the amount of animals that we needed to put in those strips to graze it down. And so for that reason, water hauling was authorized in all of those areas to help spread that grazing out and to make some of these areas possible. Next slide, please. I'll just touch on this a little bit. The ARS, Pat and his crew did most of the monitoring. Just some observations that we saw. In 2018 and 2019, it was pretty hard to keep up with it didn't seem like we were able to reach that 2-inch grazing height very well. Just because of a lot of logistical issues that we had, and trying to get enough animals out there early enough to reduce that cheatgrass enough was hard. 2020 was a different year in a lot of ways, and just from observations out on the ground, the cheatgrass didn't grow nearly as much as the other years, and we were able to kind of get our ducks in a row a little bit better this year on the BLM side, and I think everybody was able to, and we were able to get a little closer to that. But I think Pat will talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So here's just kind of an overview of the animals when the areas were grazed, and the amount of animals, the amount of cattle that were on these plots. Generally, they're grazed in the spring. 2018, T-Lazy-S was the only one that really got grazed because of fencing on some of these others, or because of just livestock operator constraints and making it work with their operations. 2019, we had a little bit of flooding and some other issues, but we were able to get some grazing. In 2020, I think we were really able to hone in and hit what we wanted to a little bit better this year. And so it'll be interesting to see how well it worked. So next slide, please. So I'll let Chris take it from here.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys. So one of the things that I just wanted to touch on is some of the challenges that we saw on our end as the livestock permittees on these targeted grazing strips. And really try to answer some of these questions that I think continue to be brought up with regards to targeted grazing. Of A, is it scalable, and B is will it work or will it not work? Some of the things that make the scalability challenging for these targeted grazing strips, and as you guys saw, we have a fairly large and fairly long strip that stretches across the base there of the mountain block. But is that it really requires a fairly large number of cattle to effectively bring down that amount of cheatgrass cover. It also requires the cattle be staged in those right areas. From Marcus's last slide there, you could see that depending on the year, we were months apart of when we would start grazing, just based on the type of spring we were having. So if we had cattle that were being fed hay down on our meadows miles away, and then all of a sudden we realized, heck, this is going to be a much earlier cheatgrass year. Just getting cattle from the river bottom up to the grazing strips in and of itself can be a challenge. And I don't think that's probably unique to our grazing strips. So something that I think we have to keep in mind when we look at these strips is how are we going to get cattle to them at those right times of year when the cheatgrass is green and we're trying to hit those objectives. Furthermore, then too, just making sure that we have the right number of cattle based on the type of year we're having. And that can be a really big challenge for a lot of producers to ramp up cattle numbers if it looks like we're going to have a bunch of cheatgrass in a year, or find somewhere to put the cattle that they were planning on putting on the grazing strip if in that given year the cheatgrass production is way down. Other thing that I think it often gets overlooked when we talk about some of these challenges with these targeted grazing strips is also what class of animals we're going to be using, because there are some reproductive questions that we have to keep in mind as we start thinking about what class of livestock we're going to use. Ideally, we'd have a whole bunch of yearling steers that we could pile out there. But again, having the right number of steers at the right time and knowing for sure that we're going to be able to use them in the grazing strip in a given year becomes a bit of a gamble year to year. That and/or for us, if there were more fall calvers in our herd, when the nutritional requirements of those cows were not quite as high during that early spring period, would also be better. Again, it's always just finding that balance of what works the best. This last year, we did use a combination of both fall calvers as well as some of our spring calvers as well. And we did see some slightly lower than expected calving rates in those breeding rates in those spring calvers coming off of this year. And could that be just part of the dry year that we had? Yep, potentially. Could it also potentially be that we were using those cattle here in this grazing strip? Yeah, potentially for sure. The other piece is the logistics of these grazing strips, as everyone touched on, Lance touched on it, Marcus touched on it, is using water and supplement to kind of control where these cattle are grazing within these strips. Even though our strip is fenced, the water availability from the far north to the far south is very hit and miss, just depending on spring runoff with only a few wells mixed in between. So having the ability to haul water is definitely a must for these grazing strips. But also we have to keep in mind that every time we fire up a water truck and we go out to fill a water trough, I mean it does cost producers money to do that, right? And that adds cost. Same with supplement. Every time we're out there replacing supplement, it's adding cost. So I think just keeping those things in mind as we design these grazing strips is going to be an important piece to see if we really can scale them across the entire landscape. One of the other things that I didn't put on the slide, but Lance touched on it quite a bit, and I think it's very important, is the ability to site these grazing strips along roads. I think is huge from numerous reasons. One, it does make, if you're hauling water, if you're doing supplement, even if you're having to get horses out to a site to do herding, it does make that logistical piece a lot simpler and a lot cheaper versus a site that, may not have any road or just a little dinky 2-track road going out to it. So, putting these things on a landscape in a spot where there already are established roads, I really do think can add to the ability to pull these things off and scale them. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This was touched on a bit in the video. This is actually the 2018 Boulder Creek fire. This fire burnt on the TS Ranch in July, about 16th, I believe, of 2018. As you can see on this figure here, the purple hash mark is the fenced grazing strip. And this fire started off on the far kind of northwesternly corner of that pink polygon, and then burned its way into that grazing strip. To discuss a bit about that, again, I think the importance of roads. The other thing is that fire stopped right along a road there. This fire was suppressed by our volunteer fire department there in Boulder Valley. And it did slow down substantially when it hit that grazing strip. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide really quick, and then I'm actually gonna have you go back. So this is the 2020 Beowawe fire that burnt into our targeted grazing strip. And I'm actually gonna have you go back to the slide before really quick. And if you look down right where the grazing strip touches Interstate 80, I don't know if who's controlling, if they have a cursor, but that's the location of where that fire burnt. It was just right down there along the interstate. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, probably not. This fire it had a lot more resources on it, including some BLM resources. And much like the Beowawe fire to the north, this fire did lay down once it got there into the targeted grazing strip. There was actually a well and water source that it kind of burnt up to, and when it got to that point, the resources were able to get around it and get this fire put out. So one of the things that I want to just mention with both of these fires is, is it realistic to say that both these fires got put out only because of that grazing strip? I don't know. Who knows, right? That's really hard to say. But both of these fires burnt into that grazing strip. Both of them were seen to then have decreased fire behavior and decreased flame length. And resources were able to get around them as they got into there, in the grazing strip, and touched up against the roads that were established there in the middle of those grazing strips. Okay, so can we scientifically for sure say that the strip is what stopped those fires? No, but would any reasonable person be able to look at these and say, wow, those grazing strips added to the ability for these suppression activities to actually get around these fires and get them stopped before they, turned into the next big 200,000 acre fire? Sure, that strip definitely helped that cause. I also want to point out that you have this white on this map that's on the screen, and that's kind of all the private property that's out in the valley bottom. But as you go to the east, you see all that checkerboard that starts climbing very, very quickly into a mountain block that is very important. Mule deer winter range. There's elk that winter in that area. There's some remaining sage grouse values. A lot of that had burnt in the early 2000s, but has responded very well. There's sagebrush coming back in. So being able to stop these fires before they burn up through that mountain block have a lot of benefits for the ranch, because we didn't lose all the AUMs that are up there. But they have huge benefits for wildlife as well, right? These are areas that are responding from past fires that have a lot of hope of coming back, if we can keep them from burning again. So I just want to stress that point that here's a great example of where these targeted grazing strips are helping us fight fires and keeping us from having the next Martin fire or the next soda fire. And to me, that in and of itself is telling me that these things should be looked at as a tool that can work across the landscape, and that we should be trying to implement them across the landscape. Are they perfect? No. Do we get the exact right stubble height on everyone every time? No. But as a tool, I think they can help us get a handle on these large fires. You can go to my next slide, although I think I already said everything on the next slide. So I think that's all I had, Melanie.
Okay, thank you. That's all we have. So I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. And Pat, I will get your next presentation up.
Well, for those that just joined us, I'm Pat Clark. I'm a range scientist with USDA Ag Research Service in Boise, Idaho. And I will be also talking about the multi-regional targeted grazing experiment that I mentioned earlier today. In this case, we're going to be talking about the Elko project that Melody and Chris just finished up with. This time we'll be looking at it from the research standpoint and providing some more research results that have come out of this. For those of you that saw my earlier talk, please bear with me. I do have some similar slides for this one that I need to go through for folks that are just joining, and then we'll get into the research results. Again, my name is Pat Clark. Next slide, please. The purpose of this multi-regional targeted grazing experiment is to evaluate the efficacy of targeted grazing for creating and maintaining fuel breaks. And the intention here really is to take the demonstration projects and different things that BLM and others are putting on the ground in response to fires or the secretarial order from 2015 3336, and put those individual case studies or demonstration projects into a larger research context, this multi-regional experiment where each one of the projects, while it's its own study in and of itself, is also a spatial replicate within this larger design that would span across the area of where cheatgrass and wildfire is a problem. And so getting back to a comment that Mike Pellant mentioned about we need to tackle the cheatgrass wildfire issue at the scale at which it happens or commiserate to that scale. And so that's what this experiment is trying to get at. In my previous talk, we talked about the Soda fire in Idaho, or the Soda project in Idaho. And I'm going to talk about the Elko project in Nevada as one more of the 3 different ongoing project sites that we have going in this experiment. Next slide, please. But we'd also, to make this truly multi-regional, we intend to, go back one, please. We intend to add additional sites. The funding for this came from the BLM Washington office, and the intent was to incrementally add sites as we go, because it's essentially impossible to get these all fired up and start at the same time. So the 3 sites have been implemented since 2017 at about 1 or 2 year increments between sites, and we intend to add some additional sites as we go along, potentially in Washington or Wyoming, and we have a site that we're looking at now where the National Park Service at Dinosaur National Park is interested in collaborating on a site there. So potentially we'd like to have at least 5 sites scattered across multiple regions to kind of span that large scope. Next slide, please. So focusing on the Elko site, as Melanie and Chris have already talked a bit about, essentially that constitutes 3 different study areas with TS, which has been talked about a lot. There's a site right north of Carlin, and then there's a site right close to Elko called Blue Basin. All of these, as you can see, lie right along the I-80 corridor, which if anybody's driven along that highway or freeway knows that's a place where there's a lot of fire starts that start from the freeway and burn out into the landscape, and has created a cheatgrass monoculture in a lot of places along there, and that those hazardous fuels threaten so a lot of good sage grouse, mule deer habitat and stuff. It's upslope and downwind from those sites. So 3 sites there at the Elko site. Next slide, please. So what we brought to this project was not only putting it into this larger research context, but we also are doing the monitoring for all these projects and sites within the experiment. We're using what we would call an enhanced AIM protocol, and in that a lot of the parameters we're measuring are the same that are measured through AIM, but we've enhanced it by putting a more research rigor to those AIM protocols, as well as added some additional variables that are relevant to monitoring target grazing. For treatment attainment, we're looking at fuel height, fuel continuity, and fuel load. For ecosystem response, or the effects of target grazing on the ecosystem, we're looking at production, changes in cover, whether it's foliar, basal, or litter cover, changes in bare ground and basal gap, and changes in species richness, abundance, and soil stability. Next slide, please. So some key findings. I promised some results. Here they are. These are interim results. This is certainly the project and the experiment are certainly still ongoing. What we are finding at the Elko project site we are being able to reduce fuel heights, both total herbaceous as well as cheatgrass. As with the Soda or Boise site, we haven't reached a 2-inch stubble height, although I think we're all finding that's less important, or may not even be the best target to be aiming for. But we are being able to apply targeted grazing in the spring, which is challenging, and reduce fuel heights effectively. We also have been able to reduce fuel continuity as measured by canopy gap. In 2020, we were able to make those changes, although we have not been able to make a significant change in fuel load at these sites. And one of the things that, and I think it was mentioned earlier in some of these talks, was carryover fuels. In some years, particularly when we had really wet springs, like 2018 spring after the heavy snowfall of 17, and then some of these other years more recently, the cheatgrass really tends to get ahead of grazing cattle, and we tend to get carryover fuels, and that was certainly the case at Elko for some of the sites. Some actually didn't have any targeted grazing applied, and so we were playing catch up on some of those. So we needed a fall grazing treatment to kind of reduce some of that residual. So we applied a fall grazing treatment at Carlin and TS in 2019. And by doing that, we did reduce the fuel load. So we anticipate as the years go forward, keeping that residual fuel load in check as need be with fall grazing would allow our spring grazing to go along a little better. Next slide, please. Just some data for folks interested in looking at bar graphs and data. What we're seeing is the majority of the total herbaceous field height change was coming from TS and much less of a response from Carlin and Blue Basin. TS, I think, is been a site that's started to get kind of the implementation figured out a little quicker than maybe the other two sites. By 2020, however, we see that all three sites have done a great job of producing fuel heights reduction all the way across the board. Next slide. Kind of the same thing going on with the cheatgrass fuel heights. Next slide. Although in 2019, we see that Carlin, even though there's a significant effect, it's actually going in the opposite direction, and that's really mainly due to that fuel load issue or residual load issue that we had, carryover fuels from previous years, which we dealt with in 19 with fall grazing and came up with a much better result in 2020. Next slide, please. And here we see reductions in fuel continuity, and that's primarily from Carlin. And I believe that result also is a result of applying some fall grazing in a timely manner when it was needed. I don't think it's necessarily needed every year, but when we do have that carryover fuels that need to be dealt with, fall grazing then coming on with the spring grazing may give us better results than the spring grazing alone during those problem years. Next slide, please. And key findings in terms of ecosystem response. In 2019, we really did not see any significant ecosystem response, but in 2020 we did, and mainly those would be the ones you would expect, the changes in cover, particularly those that were fuel targets, with more cover of cheatgrass and total folio cover still remaining in the controls. Same with litter cover, and then the opposite of litter cover being bare ground. You see more bare ground in the target grazing. We did see some changes in species richness that I need to dig into a little deeper to see if those are any concerns, or whether that's simply an increase in a few annual forbs or such. So that's something I need to ask you to stay tuned on. We'll look into that a little deeper. In terms of responses, that basically the same or similar between control and treatment. We had production, basal gap, and species abundance. Next slide, please. And we've talked about a couple of fires, so I thought I'd just flash these up. People are actually asking for some before after controlled treatment slides. So here's a few of them where we're looking at the Boulder Creek fire in 2018, as Chris mentioned, was held to 1,029 acres, stopped on a 2-track road. And even with fire retardant dumps out in the middle, it burned around those dumps, but was eventually stopped at the 2-track road within the fuel breaks. So whether it was the grazing, the water hauling, or what, there's pretty good likelihood that the treatment strip itself had some influence. And then in terms of the BYE fire this past year, that was burning actually off the freeway and into place that had a fair bit of sagebrush fuels in there with cheatgrass in the understory, and between, I believe, the grazing and the proximity to the water point, I believe that also had some influence there. But as Chris mentioned, the project and the design is really not set up to attempt to discern causality for each of these, but there's pretty strong evidence that the grazing and the strips, the fuel break strips and their proximity to these fires had an influence on fire behavior, as well as the ability to contain these fires very small as opposed to exploding into some mega fire. Next slide, please.
You got about a minute left, Pat.
Great, thank you. And in summary, Elko, just Zesota is just one of the studies that are a part of the multi-regional experiment. They're complete spatial replicates within that experiment. They're intact studies on their own with replication within them. So it's each of these are a rigorous test of the efficacy of targeted grazing as we go along. We used enhanced AIM to monitor both treatment attainment as well as the ecosystem responses to targeted grazing for fuel break creation and maintenance. We saw substantial reductions in fuel height. We saw some reductions in fuel continuity as measured by canopy gap. And we also saw some additional effects on cover. And as I mentioned in my last talk, I think really our next steps to take this forward is start looking at plugging our results into fire behavior modeling, and also take a real hard look at fuel continuity and integrating those measures into fuel modeling, particularly for this grassland fuel type. And what is the best way to actually measure fuel continuity? It may or may not be canopy gap. And with that, I'll leave it. If there's time for questions, I'll take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. All right, well, I believe now we can have a lot of time for questions and discussion. Mike, is there anything that you wanted to interject before we go on to questions?
No, but just thanks to all the speakers and to Janie for you and Corey and the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. I think things went really well, and appreciate all of the participation.
Great, thanks. All right. Yeah, now if all the presenters can turn their cameras on, and we'll move forward with questions. Let's see, let me find where we left off. Okay. I believe this is going back to Lance's presentation. Have the folks found complexities with monitoring using stubble height protocol?
Well, stubble height's easy to measure, but I think what we're struggling with, and Pat and everybody I think has mentioned it, and that is, does stubble height correlate to fuel continuity? And it doesn't really, is what we're doing. We're struggling. And again, are we using the right metric to measure for fuel continuity? And in my opinion, I don't think we've hit it. That's probably the one thing we struggle the most with on the monitoring side of this, is how do you measure when you're breaking fuel continuity for that transition for a fire to freely move versus it's struggling and hanging up and creeping around stuff where it's easy to suppress, and how, and an easy way to measure that. And we haven't got there yet. And we're willing to listen to anybody that's got an idea. The canopy gap thing, it kind of breaks down in cheatgrass because it really isn't a clumpy plant. It's real continuous and it's fine and it's dense. Yeah, so I don't know if that gets at your question or not, but that's our biggest struggle right there, is trying to find a way to measure fuel continuity in rangeland fuels.
That's great. And maybe after we get through the questions, if other folks have ideas on that, maybe that's something that we could have a discussion about right here. Okay, next question. How many or percent operators return for a second, third, or fourth year of targeted grazing? Does the BLM grazing plan recommend a multi-year commitment?
So far, all of the folks that have started with us are still with us and see the value. Again, you know, we gave them the first right of refusal in regards to implementing these treatments because their allotments lined up with the treatment. And they are fully vested. I'm just really impressed with their commitment and their attitudes. Now we do have one, but you'll have all levels of participation dependent on a year, and it's not, it doesn't go back to their whether they're invested or not. It's sometimes there's something in their operation that happens and they're not able to get the full number of cows there. And that's why, you know, you see a lot of that data that Pat was showing you, the ups and downs. Last year, the one operator really just nailed it on everything. It was, you know, it took him 3 years to figure it out, but boy, he got it all down. And I see that happening with the other ones too. But you know, there was 1 year, one operator, he just couldn't participate because of certain things that were going on with his herd. And that was a year that that field, you know, we didn't get anybody to work on it. So there's a lot of logistics going into that. And then the idea is to try to give the operators all the flexibility to try to work around those things. Yeah.
Great. Have any of the targeted grazing sites or strips been placed along the bottoms or bases of mountain ranges? Have you had problems with the cattle moving upside drainages or canyons? Yeah.
So our whole, our 30 miles of it is at the base of mountain range, the Oahes. So there's a lot of topography adjacent to the treatment. And what we're seeing, this is just a general rule of thumb from what we've learned. And that is when everything's green, it's easy to control the animals and they'll stay pretty close to the haul road, the targeted grazing treatment area. When it starts to dry out, when the fields start to dry out, that's when they want to go uphill, and that's when they start having a lot of issues in regards to holding the animals. That's when, you know, fencing and stuff really becomes valuable if you could get it to work, is fencing them to keep from going uphill, because that's what they want to do. They're chasing the green. You know, the elevation along there is probably 2,500 feet, super low, super drouthy. And once those fields turn, those cows already know that the greener stuff is right up the hill and they want to go that way. So that's when it gets tough to hold them down in that country. So, yeah.
How continuous is the reduction in fuels within each band, 200 feet versus graduated areas? And what are some of the hurdles you've encountered in establishing consistency with the stubble height grazing plan?
Well, I think we've kind of recognized that on some of the other folks talking on the Elko thing, and that is, you know, I don't think we're ever going to get to a mowed off look and then graduate, jump, you know, at 200 feet into the first quarter mile. To, you know, it's just not. It's clumpy, and you know, we're shooting for, you know, 70% of the fuel break being in that where you've actually reduced the fuels to the point that you're starting to get breaks in fuel continuity. And that's hard to describe in a document. It's hard to we've struggled with that too. Again, back to this measuring fuel continuity, and then also how to describe that in a document that you're using to authorize these treatments. It has been a real struggle. Always looking for better verbiage to describe that to people. I don't know if that answered that question or not.
Okay, thank you. Were these treatments authorized through free use permits to help offset the operator costs?
No, they weren't. So the free use permits, that'd be back to the grazing regs. And again, we authorize the treatments with a letter, an annual letter that's signed by the field office manager. And the authorization for the treatment is tied to the record of decision in the environmental assessment. It isn't tied to the grazing regs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Have you found that stubble height translates well to RDM? And I'm sorry that I don't know what RDM means off the top of my head. Do you know, Mike?
Residual
dry matter.
Oh, residual dry matter.
I don't know. I don't know that question.
Anyone else on the panel know? No.
Well, it can. That's kind of a maybe question. Even minor reductions in fuel height, because T-grass, as Lance has mentioned, tends to grow very close together. It's not clumpy. Can result in fairly large changes in fuel load. And so even though you may see a fairly minor blip in terms of reduction in fuel height, that actually represents a fairly significant reduction in fuel load. And I think that's where what that question is getting at is that residual dry matter is actually the fuel load we're talking about.
Great, thanks, Pat. Have you considered implementing different classes of stock to get to the 2-inch stubble height?
For the Boise deal, again, we're from the agency side, again, we want an outcome. And we have given all the decision space on what class. We have to use cattle because we have bighorn sheep up country from this. So sheep are off the table in that regard. But they have been experimenting. One operator's actually even used dairy cows one year. He had a situation where he couldn't actually use his, again, back to this, every year is different in what they've got going on with their other permits, right? He actually used dairy cows to do his targeted grazing from a local dairy. Yeah, and we've had him using just the yearlings, cow calf pairs. They've used just about everything. Yep.
Yeah, and just to touch on that as well. I mean, if the question meant, again, different classes of livestock, meaning different species, we're all going to be held to whatever our permits allow as far as species go. So for most of you, that's going to be cattle. But then again, like we touched on as well, we've looked at different classes of cattle, but more from an animal health standpoint, just trying to match, the right type of cattle to these treatments. That's my 2 cents on looking at different classes of livestock.
Thanks, Chris.
Just real quick follow-up on that. With these demonstration areas, one of the important things is comparing apples to apples. And so we've purposely not mixed sheep and cattle grazing because of the differences of different effects on the fine fuels. So as part of the replicated study that Pat's doing, it's important that we just have the one class. The other, again, at a landscape scale, what's ubiquitous is the cattle, not the sheep on the landscape for the most part. So that it couldn't be used in their situations, especially in the urban wildland interface. The sheep use is a great tool, but for these broad landscapes, given the lack of numbers of sheep, we're pretty much going to be focused on cattle.
Thanks. Next question, are the reported means for the entire width of the fuel break a 1/4 mile or just for the 200 feet section around the road? And I'm sorry that I don't remember exactly what.
Or so again, if I understand the question right, it's 200 feet each side of the road is the 2-inch or less stubble height. And then another 1/4 mile is 30% 30% utilization. And then a 1/4 mile past that, 16% utilization. So that's the graduated use.
Great, thank you.
In terms of, I think he was talking about the means between targeted grazing and control. And yes, the targeted grazing is at 200 feet. That's where we have our sample plots. That's the treatment part of it. And then our control areas are at least a quarter mile. So they're a quarter to probably half to 3/4 of a mile from the treatment area, because we wanted to definitely get out of the area where there would be graduated use or well beyond what we would expect to be graduated use associated with the treatment.
Thank you. Pat, this next one is directed to you. How is fuel load much more reduced in the targeted grazing areas than vegetation height in those areas? Are they not directly related?
Well, if you think about cheatgrass, and I talked about it just a minute ago, and that is that it doesn't take very many inches of reduction in cheatgrass because it grows so close together and in some ways can be a carpet. It doesn't take many inches of reduction in fuel height to add up to a very large load reduction. And of course that varies year to year. Cheatgrass can be 4 inches tall, struggling to survive all spring long, and then it can be 14 inches long and happy as a clam with a huge amount of load. So that relationship between height and load varies year to year. But in general, just a small reduction in height is going to end up to be a fairly significant load.
Thank you. Cheatgrass height didn't seem to be affected that much, yet cheat fuels did decrease a good amount. Oh, I think it's the same, about the same question. How did that happen? Was there less tillering, decreased cheatgrass density from grazing? Can you explain what's going on there?
Well, I suppose there may be some reduced cheatgrass density. I mean, that's measured in our species abundance, although generally that doesn't turn out to be a significant effect. So it's mainly, as I just described, that change in fuel height actually adds up to quite a load, even though it doesn't look like when you look on a bar graph, there's not much difference, but it turns out to be a fairly large change in load.
Thank you. Another question for you, Pat. When was the monitoring done relative to the grazing treatment? How did the rainfall vary between the 2 years?
So the treatment attainment monitoring was done during the treatment application and immediately after the treatment application. And so most years that would be April, May timeframe, depending on the timing of moisture and the phenology of the cheatgrass. And then the ecological response or ecosystem response monitoring was done at the peak production for this system, and basically it's based off of sagebrush and some of the other perennials in terms of when the timing of that peak production was. So that's when we started monitoring that. And yes, certainly there were differences in precip between years, as there has been since 2017. It seems like every year is a different animal in terms of precip and timing of that precip and timing of changes in temperature, going from a cool wet spring or even a cold wet spring to a blazing hot dry spring. And just a matter of a few days or a few weeks can make that change. And that presents the challenge for applying that treatment with cheatgrass responding so quickly to those climatic changes. So that is part of the challenge with applying grazing in the spring.
Thank you. Not sure who this is directed to, or maybe everyone. If the supplement could be used to provide desired seed through the gut of the cow, thus reducing seeding costs, would this be useful for offsetting some of the costs?
Well, that's kind of a question that's more aimed at the ecological restoration of sites, although, and that's not really our aim in a fuel break per se. We don't want it to go degrade because of treatment, but on the other hand, we're not really in the business to move the ecological status within that field break forward. I mean, it'd be great if it happened, but that's not really the target. Although if applying that seed as part of a target grazing treatment did increase the amount of perennials in the system, it's open to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing in a field break. And Mike might be able to comment on that better, but there's certainly other places for that, I believe, particularly as we talked about fall grazing to reduce fuels as well as promote ecological restoration.
Yeah, I actually think that working with the green stripping program with strips of fire resistant vegetation, we actually had green strips that grazed in the spring. It would reduce the cheatgrass in the interspace with early spring use. And the really positive thing we found by doing that, the crested wheatgrass and green strip stayed green longer into the fire season. So I think an integrated approach, and there may be some opportunities to get perennial grasses, things like crested wheatgrass that can withstand the grazing in, and then have long-term a more dependable forage source so that you're not dependent on the vagaries of the cheatgrass production from next to nothing in one year to 2,000 or 3,000 pounds per acre in another year. So I think a longer-term strategy might involve establishing grazing tolerant fire resistant species in these areas and still managing them as a grazed fuel break.
Thanks. Next question, being how fuel breaks are placed along roads, has there been any PR backlash in terms of the public mistaking this as overgrazing occurring on BLM allotments?
Not from, not on the Boise. No, not in regards to our fuel breaks and our grazing along those. No.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything on our end either on our fire breaks.
Yeah, I am not aware of anything coming into our office.
Great. This next question is for Chris. Do you think that the BLM or other landowners should be paying the rancher for the additional cost of bringing cattle to create the fire break, labor, fuel, potential loss of animal production?
Not specifically, no. I think these fuel breaks, when implemented, if they are able to stop fires like they have for us, I think they benefit both the permittee as well as the public land user and the BLM. I think having the flexibility to be able to implement these things is truly the benefit that the majority of private landowners and permittees are going to be looking for. So what I mean by that is, if there are ways in, as these projects move forward to, not take a huge hit on your AUMs on your actual permit so that you can implement a fire break, those types of incentives, I think, are going to be the carrot that keeps these projects moving forward into the future.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is any monitoring occurring within the allotments, pastures, base properties where these cattle would normally be grazing to see if we're getting any environmental benefits from reduced stocking pressure?
I don't believe there's any additional data being collected in our area that's trying to show that one way or the other. I don't know about any of the other projects, but that's not an aim of any of the data that's being collected in our area, I don't believe.
For the Boise, no, we aren't. We're focusing our monitoring in and around those treatment objectives. The normal rangeland health monitoring and all that stuff goes on allotment wide. Of course, it doesn't impact any of that. So I think that's a no on that answer.
Next question, how difficult is it not to overgraze the fire breaks but still graze enough to stop or contain a fire?
I guess I can take my turn. I'll let you pass it on to Lance. I think the challenge is getting enough mouths or enough cattle there at the right time in the right place. So actually to remove the amount of fuel that we want to remove has been the challenge more than overdoing it. So that's at least that's what we're seeing on the research sites.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, it's definitely it's all about logistics and getting the animals there at the right time to eat off the cheatgrass before it can respond again. Hopefully, you want to hit it when it can't respond, so when you graze it, it's not going to have any regrowth as you go into fire season. You know.
Yeah, and I'll touch on this one too, just really briefly. You know, I think I think it's been a struggle at times for us to to get enough cattle to have the effect we want across the entire grazing strip. But with that said, there's always going to be areas that are getting hit harder, right? If we have a permanent water source with a grazing strip, those areas might be getting overgrazed. However, with that said, in areas like ours where we have predominantly a cheatgrass monoculture where these strips are occurring, and the intent is to protect the very highly valuable habitat on the mountain block above. In my opinion, those impacts, if they are a bit heavy at times, if it's having the intended results protecting that mountain block, I think that they're being successful, even if we are having areas that are slightly overgrazed.
Thank you. Does measuring both stubble height and bare ground combined address fuel conductivity?
Continuity, I think, is what was the intent there, maybe. It sort of does. Bare ground is we're measuring with LPI, line point intercept, and so it's more or less a cover type measure. So it doesn't really get at the patchiness of bare ground, and that is the challenge. When we're trying to break up fuels, we're essentially trying to increase patchiness. And so a lot of the traditional measures like cover measures don't get at that very well. The creation of basal gap and canopy gap size by Jeff Herrick and others as part of the monitoring manual was intended to get at that, but that was really designed primarily for shrub dominated systems like they have down the Oronata. That was the motivation down there. And I think we're finding that in grassland systems, is not quite effective, particularly those grassland systems that are becoming annual systems, which do not have a bunch grass component or a very little bunch grass component still in them. So cheatgrass is coming up wherever the seed lands. And so I think we're kind of at a point decision whether we need a new measure for fuel continuity in this fuel type. That's my 2 cents anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, I might add just a thought on that. I've kind of struggled with fuel continuity in cheatgrass forever. And I'm almost thinking that if there was a way to monitor stubble height continuously, that might be a better measure of continuity, and that lower stubble height would translate into more of a break in terms of the fuel continuity versus the higher the stubble height, then the more potential for spread. But yeah, I agree with you, Pat. I think we're still a ways off from how best to, it's something you can see and know that there's a lot of fuel continuity. It's hard to say how much it's been reduced with any of the metrics that we're using now.
And thanks for that lead in. I think the way to go when we're starting to do it is with UAV photography, where you can see and measure fuel height, fuel structure, with structural motion techniques to do that continuously. And that may be the saving grace. We may be able to do that particularly straightforward on fuel breaks because they're long linear and so we don't have that aerial constraint for large areas. So UAVs might be the saving grace. Thanks.
Thank you. Has targeted grazing been compared with pre-emergent herbicide and cost and efficiency for fuel breaks?
The answer to that's probably no. And, you know, I think, again, there's some pros and cons of using the herbicides. And I don't think it's just strictly a cost issue. There's some environmental concerns as well, but it's probably a valid comparison to talk about. But the idea of having to go out every year with the variability of cheatgrass and design a herbicide application to do the same thing that a cow can do, I think would be as or more challenging than using the livestock permittee and their knowledge with the livestock to manage the cheatgrass. Just a thought, though.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly touch on this one. You know, we've done roughly 10,000 acres of pre-emergent herbicide treatments and seeding directly adjacent to where our grazing strips are. And I think, you know, overall they're different techniques, right? What we're trying to do with this targeted grazing is create this kind of annual fire break to, you know, slow or stop fires, where, you know, really these larger scale herbicide treatments are hopefully a one-time treatment followed up by a seeding application that then gets a perennial component back into those systems. So could you use the pre-emergent every year for the next 20 years on a strip? Sure, I guess you could, although I just don't think, like Mike's saying, it's necessarily the correct use of that tool. That tool should be focused more on, you know, restoring large tracts that we're trying to get back into some perennial function from annual dominance.
Great, thanks for that perspective. Have you received any complaints, litigation from other livestock operators that want to do treatments when you're giving the permittees first right of refusal, even though they have no preference and since there's no connection to the grazing regulations?
Let's see, just so I didn't confuse anybody. The first right of refusal goes to the permit holder that the treatment is going through. So they do have a preference, and they do have, you know, they are tied to the grazing regs, to that piece of ground for the grazing administration. Now, we designed a treatment in and around the grazing regs. So no, we haven't had any complaints. The people that normally graze those allotments are the ones that are implementing our treatments, because that's the first right of refusal. We actually had 2 years where one of the operators, permittees, didn't want to partake in the treatment, and we got a neighbor to actually go in and do the grazing in that allotment. We actually had that happen for 2 years. And then we've actually had where allotments have been sold and other people have come in and then subleased it to somebody else. I mean, you got every little thing going on there. So no, we haven't had any complaints. I mean, I guess unless it's people saying, hey, we'd like to do this in our country, how do we get it going where we're at? That's not a complaint, that's more of a statement. So yeah, we haven't had any complaints that I know of.
Great, thanks. Lance, this next question is for you. When seeding fuel breaks along the roads, what kind of mixture are used? Well, in the low elevation, you know, it's all about elevation in our country. Anything above 4,500 feet, you're in pretty good natives. So we usually primarily native mixes above 4,500 feet. Below 4,500 feet, if it's an area that's still got a lot of remnant natives and stuff, we'll mix natives with crested. But if it's down along this haul road, we're going straight crested. It's the only thing that'll compete at that 2,500 foot elevation. And you know, we also wrote in our environmental assessment, you know, that if this grazing treatment experiment, whatever you want to call it, if it doesn't work, or if we decide that we don't want to do it, or the permittees, maybe they decide, hey, we don't want to do this anymore for whatever reasons, we can just put in a forage kochia fuel break along that front.
So that's our backup, and that was authorized in the EA also. So again, back to that flexibility, which I think where we'll probably end up over time is we have a core group of operators that are really committed and are really making this work. And then we've got one or two that isn't. And I think we'll probably over time, probably put forage koshi into those couple pastures that the folks aren't committed. And then the other ones will probably go on with this, you know.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Pat. Have you started looking at how any remote sensing tools could complement the data needed? And it sounds like you started to answer this.
Yes, in fact, oftentimes when we're starting up a project, we need to quickly collect some data on a new site or something. And so we've been using UAVs to collect that kind of data, both to get at cover as well as vegetation structure. And we're working on some research to at least do functional type or growth form classifications with the intent of doing species composition somewhere down the road. Those are active research topics that we're working on for this work. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I would think that fuel load, excuse me, stubble height and shrub canopy cover would tell us a lot about fire behavior. I don't know if that was a question or a comment. And then also thank you. This has been a great session.
I can answer, and Lance probably could too. For the most part, the fuel breaks we're talking about are primarily herbaceous, cheatgrass, potentially some residual bunch grasses and things, but not a lot of shrub cover. And in the Boise site, the shrub cover that's there has been mowed. In Elko, there certainly are some sites that have some shrub cover, but for the most part, it is herbaceous dominated, cheatgrass or medusa head type systems. So the shrub side of the fuel load is not in there. So really looking at fuel height as the main driver for the fuel models, as well as the fuel load. And so we are measuring both of those. But as we've discussed many times already, that fuel continuity is a missing factor in this fuel model, I think, and that's something we need to get at. So leave it there.
Thank you. That was all the questions. There were a lot of thanks, and this was a great session, and looking forward to seeing how this turns out. So Mike, do you want to spend, we have about just over 10 minutes left. Do we want to have a discussion on what might be an alternative to, excuse me, monitoring fuel stubble height? Do we want to go back to that? What do you want to do with the last 10 minutes?
Well, I think we could. I mean, the other thing I'd just like to reiterate is, again, we'd like your help. Number one, on the website, literature, any reports, anything that's going on. We want to connect these dots across the Great Basin. So feed that information in through us. We'll get it on the website. We'll build that network so that it can connect up the various individuals that are working on this, so that we kind of got a knowledge base out there that I think we could really tap. The other thing would just be, we'd like to go a little deeper in terms of a workshop to really incorporate more of the permittee input and do this kind of question and answer. At 2.5 hours is a great start, but I think we can certainly bring this up to the next level as well. You know, with that, I think probably we're not going to 10 minutes not do justice to that question, but hopefully we can kind of, through the website and through the Targeted Grazing Resource Center on it, can facilitate some of these discussions and information sharing there as well.
Okay, do we have that capability yet? I'm trying to remember.
No, again, the Resource Center is a prototype, but I think based upon this discussion, we will really kind of accelerate getting it all fleshed out. And as you use it, if you've got some suggestions to improve, please let us know. We really want to strive to make this something that, again, is kind of the one-stop shopping on this topic. with working with these invasive annual grasses and fuel and the fire problem and restoring them through dormant season grazing, all of that. I think we have a great opportunity to work together and you know, help solve this big problem.
Great, thanks. And it looks like Elise, I think it was, put that link in the fun stuff tab. I'm assuming that's on the SRM meeting page. So thank you very much for that.
And then I'd just like to add that if any of the BLM range management specialists or field managers that are on this symposium know of permittees that might be interested in looking at targeted grazing as an option, the headquarters office is looking at the possibility of putting another proposal out for call for proposals for projects. So if you know of folks that might be interested in participating, you can send me an email and let me know. And if we get enough interest, we may consider putting another call for proposals out.
Jessica, do you want to put your email in the chat?
Sure.
Thanks. And
I guess I would second that in that we definitely still need additional sites as part of this grand experiment we've got going on. So particularly folks in Washington State or Wyoming or areas that are not necessarily in the Great Basin proper, we're interested in hearing from you and your interest in doing this kind of work. So if you have cheatgrass and a wildfire problem, or Medusa and a wildfire problem, or even red brome as a wildfire problem, get a hold of me as well as Jessica and let us know of your interest in participating. Thank you.
And Pat, do you want to add your email to the chat too?
Certainly, thank you.
Thank you. And then someone, I don't know if they were referring to our Targeted Grazing Resource Center. It says, will you have monitoring suggestions for specific targeted grazing goals? I do. So is that something you envision being part of that discussion feature?
Yeah, certainly. I think, you know, with the data that Pat's collecting and the protocols, with maybe the exception of the fuel continuity, the more that we can kind of collect data the same way, then the more we have a little better comparative abilities between these different sites. So yeah, I think we can post that protocol, Pat, and then that might be a good starting point moving forward for people to use, and especially to collect data specific to fine fuels and targeted grazing.
Certainly happy to provide that.
Yeah, so you can contact us through the Targeted Grazing Resource Center or our website, and yeah, so when we have that up and running, we can add your suggestions. And then it looks like there were some questions specifically about Jessica, the proposals you're talking about. So Jessica put her email in the chat, so if you want to follow up with her, she can answer those, I'm sure. And that looks like it. Thank you so much, all the presenters and all the attendees. Thanks for sharing your expertise, and thanks for the great questions.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Corey, for doing such a great job facilitating and getting this pulled together to work so effectively. I saw we had 195% participants at one point, so very well attended. Thank you to all the participants that are still in there as well.
Yeah, great. All right, have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.